Saturn isn't a planet to be taken lightly, but don't let it scare you just because it's intimidating or hard to work with at times. This is a planet that teaches you all about structure, discipline, boundaries, and clears karmic contracts that no longer serve you in your life throughout its cycles in your natal chart. Hello everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Hummingbird Arcana Podcast. I'm Jo Hummingbird. I'm an Evolutionary Astrologer, Usui Reiki Master, and a Tarot and Oracle card specialist. I'm here to awaken you to your cosmic divinity, and today I wanted to bring you an episode all about the planet Saturn and its cycles, the most impactful influences that those cycles have on you in your natal chart in your life. This is a planet that, like I mentioned in the little mini intro, that is super intimidating at times, but I don't want it to scare you. So we're going to unpack it a little bit here. We're going to dive into it, make it easy to understand, make it something that we can integrate without it being super scary or super dense. So if you're interested in learning all about Saturnian cycles, then keep on listening to this episode of Hummingbird Arcana. If you're not sure where to start when it comes to booking a session, I feel you 100%. With all the different wisdom that we integrate on our spiritual paths, it can really get overwhelming to look at all of your options for tools to help you integrate it. So if you feel intuitively called to book a session, but you don't know which one would be the best fit for you for what you're looking for, I'm now making free discovery calls available for you. And in this complimentary 30-minute call, we will briefly discuss what areas of your focus are on your path with zero pressure for you to immediately book a session after. You are in the driver's seat the whole time, all the way through. Bookings for free discovery calls are open now, and the link is in the description box or the show notes below if you want to get one for yourself. Now let's get back into this episode of Hummingbird Arcana. So I mentioned in the beginning that Saturn, again, it is an intimidating planet. It is the planet that rules Capricorn and Aquarius from traditional standpoint, and solely Capricorn from a modern standpoint. So this, you think of your pop astrology energy of Saturn, you think of, coldness, you think of harsh truth, you think of no remorse, you think of all of these really intense and not just intimidating from like a broken record repeating the same word type standpoint, but intimidation from a biochemical standpoint. Like it kind of activates this primal fear within us, because we hear Saturn and we hear the words karma and we hear discipline and we hear boundaries, and we think of really, really challenging experiences. And yeah, there is a lot of challenging experiences that come from Saturn as a planet in our natal chart and throughout its transits in our chart in our lifetime. Not all of them will always be challenging, though. That's why we're going to be talking about the 4 most important Saturn cycles today. These are going to be your Saturn conjunction, which is also your Saturn return, depending on if it's, you still have Saturn in your chart and you're very young and you have really woke parents that teach you about astrology from a young age. Cool, good for you. Then we're going to be talking about the first Saturn square. We're going to talk about your second Saturn square as well later on. We're going to talk about Saturn oppositions as well, because these are going to be the 4 most key part of Saturn's cycle through your chart. Yes, we can talk about sextiles, we could talk about trines, we could talk about all these supportive things, but to make the challenges of Saturn a little bit more grounded and approachable, we're going to be diving into those specifically in ways that help us empower ourselves with them, rather than become victim to what it's trying to teach us. A lot of the times you hear a lot of people in pop astrology talk about a Saturn return, and you don't even hear it just in pop astrology alone. You hear it even in modern pop culture. A lot of artists or different celebrities have talked about that experience for themselves and how it has affected their fame or their ability to have impact on the world. And their relationship to Saturn is really, really important, especially if they're going to be in the spotlight and share that experience. And so I want to bring you a little bit of insight here to help it make it a little bit more approachable for you. So we're going to start with the Saturn conjunction. This can also be technically your Saturn return. Again, it goes both ways depending on if, you have some cool parents that are teaching you about astrology early on. Awesome. Good for you. And if not, then you're just learning about a Saturn return because you're going through it right now. Hi. Hello. I am so happy that you're here because Saturn returns are really hard. Luckily, in my lifetime, I haven't gone through my first Saturn return yet, but I remember when Saturn was still in my sign as a kid, and that is a very vivid memory for me. I have Saturn in Gemini natally, and it is conjunct my moon sign. Now, that's at the beginning of Gemini for me. It's within the first 10 degrees, so the first decan. And with that being said, this gave me a lot of time. It gave me about 3.5 years between retrograde periods of Saturn to really come to conscious awareness. And I have my first memory from the age of 2. And so everything after that, I remember. And Saturn in Gemini, of course, facts, logic, learning. Saturn, long-term investments, really big chunks of time. Of course I'm going to remember my earliest memories, especially if they're having to do with Saturn. And I'm a Capricorn, ruled by Saturn. So, of course, I remember Saturn energy for me. It was a lot about, in the beginning, for people who, this is, again, pertaining to the conversation of people who are learning astrology from a younger age or who want to reflect even back on the earlier years of their life while Saturn was still transiting through their sign, depending on where it is in your sign. And if you want to learn more about the decans, I'll link the video or the podcast episode for you, depending on if you're watching or streaming. But I'll link that for you down below or on this card screen for you. But depending on where Saturn is in the sign in which it was when you were born, you'll be able to trace back what experiences were happening for you for your Saturn conjunction, or, like we've also talked about, your Saturn return, if that's what you're going through now. Saturn returns happen every 29.5 years on average, give or take half a year or so, or maybe even a year at most, or 2, if you're really pushing it, given the retrograde periods, which, again, if you haven't learned about retrogrades and direct and station and shadow, I will also link that episode for you down below in the description, as well as in the show notes or on the screen with the card if you're watching on YouTube. But with Saturn being in the same sign as it was when you were born, regardless of if this is a return or if you're just remembering and reflecting back on the early years of your life, Saturn will be giving you structure. It will be building things up. It will be providing a foundation for everything else to be launched from. And for me with Saturn in Gemini, for the first few years of my life, because Saturn was at the beginning of Gemini for me when I was born, I got to experience Saturn in Gemini for the next few years of my life after being born. And my first memory at 3, aside from being in the crib at 2 and me just having like a flash memory of sitting in a crib and looking at the light in the hallway, my first real memory was me going on a vacation with my family to San Antonio, Texas, which I'm from Texas, natally. And so we took a family trip down there, and it was such a, for lack of better terms, a turning experience. It was, we had to be patient with traffic. We had to communicate with each other as a family unit. We had to agree on things, and there were lots of disagreements, but there was also a lot of fun once we got the structure of it figured out and we got a plan for the day, or we got an itinerary, or the money lined up, or we were all on the same page, or what have you. There was also a lot of, discipline involved for the kids who were misbehaving, myself and my brothers included in that. But with that being said, the Saturn energy of being in the same spot when it was when you were born, it kind of doesn't throw you for a loop as much when you're a kid, obviously, because it hasn't returned. It's still just right there where it was. But when you're looking at a Saturn return, this is when Saturn has gone through a complete full cycle of its rotation around the sun, or its evolution around the sun, excuse me. So with that being said, it's gone through a full cycle in your natal chart. It has gone through every single other sign and has come back to where it was when you were born. So Saturn, the planet of boundaries, of restriction, of karma, of discipline, it has gone through every single possible evolution and de-evolution possible for you in your chart, depending on what signs are experiencing what kind of conditioning or energy based off of where they are or how they're influenced by other planets in your natal chart. And if you're wondering how you can take a look at that kind of energy, you can book an express transit chart reading with me in the description box. It's only $11 for about a 15-minute session. We can very quickly break down what's going on with the sky right now, and we can also focus a little bit more on Saturn if that's what you wish to do. But with Saturn returns, this is a time where all of the lessons from having moved through all of the other signs, all 11 other signs, until it got back to your natal sign, this creates every possible lesson to have learned from a karmic standpoint. This clears all of the different archetypes in which Saturn can express itself for it to come at you and challenge your natal blueprint with. If, let's throw into another example of one of these other Saturn cycles. And throughout that 29.5 on average year evolution, you'll experience 2 Saturn squares and a Saturn opposition. Now, let's talk about the Saturn square first, the first one. This is something that you experience between the ages of 7 and 9 years old on average. Again, give or take months, or about half a year up to a year, maybe 2, depending on the retrograde periods. But with that being said, this creates a square. This is a 90-degree angle between where Saturn would be in the sky and where Saturn is in your natal chart by placement. So a square is not just the greatest challenge, but it is a profound and impactful challenge that requires you to evolve. It is not one where it gets you to balance out a perspective on the opposite end of what you're viewing it from, like an opposition would, but this is giving you almost like, it throws you for a loop. It comes out of left field almost. It's like, what the fuck just happened? A lot of the times around 7 years old, from a biophysical standpoint, that is when you cognitively develop self-awareness from a psychology standpoint as an autonomous little human being that you are when you're growing, and it's been about 7, give or take, years into your development psychologically and physically. That's when you get to develop at least a little bit of autonomy and self-awareness. You kind of start developing a moral code. You start learning what's right from wrong from the inside out, rather than just being told no or yes by somebody who can dictate your morals for you. This is when Saturn, the place of structure, boundaries, and restriction, and karma and discipline, gets challenged to evolve for the first time. Now for me, around 7, 8, 9 years old, my first Saturn square, that was when my parents got divorced and my family split up. Now, that Saturn square would have been Saturn through Virgo for me, because I have Saturn in Gemini natally. So Saturn in Virgo versus Saturn in Gemini, even though they're both ruled by Mercury, you would think that they would get along a little bit easier. No, this is, every mutable sign squares the other one or opposes it. It's not going to be a harmonious relationship between any of the mutable signs whatsoever. So Saturn in Gemini squaring Saturn in Virgo. Saturn in Virgo is a lot more, okay, we got to work hard, we got to get things done, we have to do the grunt work that nobody wants to do, and we have to do it when nobody's looking, because integrity and completion matters more than perfection right now. And then my Saturn in Gemini natally is like, oh, but I want to learn, I want to do what I want when I want to build a structure around my ability to express myself, I want to develop a structure that helps me connect with community. And as you see, my community, my family, Saturn does also rule your connection to your ancestry and the physical world of that, not just like the spiritual connection from like a karma standpoint. It definitely does influence the karma from your family, and it has an impact there. But from the more physical developmental standpoint, this put a physical separation between 2 parts of my family. The one that was more communal and self-expressive, and the other one that was more hardworking and less emotionally involved. So with that being said, that of course makes sense why that happened during my first Saturn square. And I would encourage you to look back at when you were between the ages of 6 and 9/10 years old to see the preemptive influences of what your upcoming first Saturn square would have done, leading into the Saturn square itself around 7 and 8 years old, and then towards 9 and 10, looking at the residual effects of what it was doing when it was weaning away from that Saturn square. Now, getting into the Saturn opposition, which would happen next chronologically, this happens at 14, anywhere between 13 and 16 really, but it happens at the heightened point of 14, 14 and a half, 15, around that age. So if you're from the United States, or if you are familiar with that kind of a school system, I'm not sure how it works in other countries too much, because I was born and raised in the United States, and that's culturally what I'm used to. But around that time frame is when you're leaving middle school and going into high school for the first time. So 13 turning 14 is around 8th grade, and then 14 turning 15 is freshman year of high school. So that was my first Saturn opposition. And for me, personally, that was a time of huge transformation and self-awareness, because Saturn was then in my opposite sign natally from my natal Saturn in Gemini over in Sagittarius. And funnily enough, I have my South Node in Sagittarius and my North Node in Gemini. So for me personally, this was a time where discipline, karma, boundaries, the ability to set a foundation for myself and take accountability in different ways, in ways that I really hadn't practiced a whole lot other than in really, really, really early on in this lifetime or in previous lifetimes before this one. This is where I was getting a lot of wisdom and download and insight, but it was really hard to find a way to make that expressive because natally in Sagittarius, I also have Pluto. So Pluto plus Saturn plus South Node, that's a lot, especially when it's opposing your natal Saturn and North Node. So this is a time where the powerful past life lessons and spiritual connection that I have to the universe and the transformation, the death, rebirth, was then being put on blast by Saturn's need for structure and discipline and grounding of that very experience. So I invite you to look at when you were between the ages of 13 and 16 to see what was going on for you in your life. Obviously, if you were in the United States, then chances are you were also moving out of, secondary school into high school or whatever your version of what they called middle school for you was, whether it was junior high or just middle school, secondary school, whatever that was for you. Regardless, I invite you to look back and see what was happening with your theme in Saturn. It's always going to be opposing after, 14, 15 years. So that's a given. It's going to have the theme of expanding the axis in which Saturn would then be placing itself natally and in the sky by transit. So, for me, that axis is Gemini and Sagittarius, the student and the teacher, the facts versus the experience. So that was a lot of what was going on for me. It was people were trying to be super factual and logical with me, but my experiences were telling me something more powerful and different than what people were trying to convince me of personally. And for you, maybe that Saturn's on a different axis. Maybe you have Saturn in Taurus natally, and your Saturn opposition happens in Scorpio. So this has to do with the body and senses and self-worth. This is your ability to find worth in yourself versus other people's ability to find worth in you from the outside, and trying to find a balance on how you can set boundaries with yourself and others to have that be a more harmonious experience for you, even if it was really hard. That could also be a time where there's something, goddess forbid, something a little more sexual happens to you in a bad way, or maybe it was a time where you watched that happen to somebody else and it traumatized you to a point to where you protected your body or your livelihood. Goddess forbid, but I am sending so much love to you if that is your timeline and that is your truth. Goddess bless and heal that for you, and I hope that you get to experience liberation from that trauma in this lifetime. I amplify that for you. But another example, maybe there could be a different opposition here. Let's pull up, let's say Pisces and Virgo, even, this opposition. Maybe you have Saturn in Pisces natally, and you experienced your Saturn opposition when it was in Virgo. So Pisces is going to be a lot of spirituality. It's going to be the boundless side of nature. It's going to be the part of us that is emotionally in tune with the spirit of ourselves and the cosmos and the Great One. It's a lot more unity-based and it's a bit more detached. So this is a place where Saturn can kind of go to dissolve a lot of its rigidity. And then it goes opposite over there in Virgo, which is a little more mercurial, and it is a lot more, structured and requires a lot of analysis, attention to detail, a lot of focus. And so maybe your detached nature of who you are was balanced out during this time of maybe you acquired a little bit more discipline. Maybe you started focusing on things that mattered to you more with a little bit more gumption and audacity. Maybe you pursued these parts of your life and maybe not necessarily isolated yourself from everyone and everything to do it, but maybe you had to tune out the noise from everybody else in order to get that done. So that's just an example of what the Saturn opposition can look like, how it can be integrated.
Astrology can help us determine the complexities of human relationships in so many different ways, but one of the best ways is through synastry charts. These charts can help us to directly understand what is unfolding between two people in this lifetime and in lifetimes behind us or beyond us. Whether or not they're involved with each other romantically, platonically, ancestrally, professionally, or even otherwise, synastry is still going to be one of the easiest ways to discover the dynamics of different soul connections. And if you want to see what cosmic connection you have with a certain someone in your life or on your mind or in your heart, then head to the link in the description box or in the show notes below to book your synastry chart reading with me today. Now, back to Hummingbird Arcana.
Moving chronologically next into the second Saturn square, this is, again, what happens. Saturn moves in 7-year cycles, you'll notice. So from the time that you were born, 0 to 3, it's in the same sign. 7-ish years later, between 6 and 10, then you'll have the Saturn square. Then 7 years later, between 13 and 16, Saturn opposition. 7 years later, between 19 and 23 will be the Saturn square again, and then 7 years later, between 28 to 31, you'll have the Saturn return. You see how Saturn moves in these 7-year cycles, and it's going to happen all the time. They kind of start off, and then you'll feel it, and then it'll hit really impactfully, and then you'll feel it wane off, and you'll have a few years in between that to integrate and kind of regulate yourself from the experience before another one of these cycles happens. So you're never going to escape it. This is the realm of the physically dense world. This is the third density world, and as such, Saturn does rule that world materially and from a quote-unquote harsh reality standpoint. So we won't ever be able to escape that so long as we're alive. Lucky us, right? But that doesn't mean that we can't work with these cycles as much as possible to empower ourselves and to prepare ourselves for when they do happen. So, also, I do apologize if you do hear any crazy background noise. I am in a different country, and I'm in a neighborhood that is lively on the weekends and is quiet during the week. And of course, right now is some ample time that I have to record, and the neighborhood is booming. So people are blasting music, there are kids running around outside, some dogs are barking, sounds like the trash truck is here to take some stuff. But if you hear that, I will do my best to edit that out in post, but my apologies if I can't get everything. And I really despise that from a mercurial moon standpoint as a Gemini moon, and all be that ruled by Saturn and trying to get things kind of perfect, but not perfectionistically perfect. But forgive me if I can't have full control over that. But I digress. So with the second Saturn square, this again typically happens anywhere between 19 and 23 years old. It is going to heighten itself at the ages of 20, 21, and 22. Right now I'm 24, so I just survived my second Saturn square, and boy was that hellacious for me as a Saturn-ruled being. I never want to do that again, but I know that I'm going to have to because Saturn squares happen more often than returns or oppositions. There are 2 of them versus 1 of each of the other. So for me, this second Saturn square involved, right before the time leading up to that Saturn square, I was making the most money I'd ever made. I was fulfilling my dreams. I had my dream job. I was helping clients. I had made 6 figures for the first time in my life. I was the #1 selling item at my local metaphysical shop. And I, for my services, not as a weird way, but in the system, if you were tracking sales, my name for my services was the #1 selling item in the system that month. And it was for January and then for the first half of February of that time for me. And that was really impactful. It was really beautiful. And then my second Saturn square came into full effect. And it was no longer about having fun and doing what I wanted and having my dream job. It was about all of the ways in which this dream job or this vision that I had for myself was trying to play itself out karmically in new ways. And it was not the most fun time. I ended up having to leave that job because I got, for the lack of a better term, bullied out of it by management when the owner loved what I did and believed in what I did, but the people who she had then taking over her legacy for this shop that I was working at then decided to make up a bunch of different lies about me based off of the fact that my work got affected by me almost losing my mom to a malpractice surgery that she psychically asked me for advice on if she should get, and I said no because I feel like something bad will happen And then lo and behold, it did. These people held it against me instead of having compassion for me, and then decided to bully me and also talk mess about me to my best friend, who I ended up living with right after I decided to stop associating myself with those people. And that was horrendous. That was when Saturn entered Pisces and squared my natal Saturn in Gemini. Now, you would think that Saturn going into Pisces would then kind of dissolve a lot of the rose-colored glasses look that people would be able to skew my image through. But what it did was, because Pisces is in my third house of Gemini, and I am a Gemini moon natally, and Saturn was in then the third house by transit, and then in my sixth house by natal position, this squared my sixth house daily job work, making money, and it was my third house of community and connections. So of course, they were going to try to slander me based off of who I was expressing myself to be and how I had the capacity to show up based off of who was dying in my life. And Saturn, in extreme cases of restriction and death, placed in the sign of Pisces, the final sign of the zodiac, where everything kind of goes into the void to pass back into spirit form, away from the material realm. It's where Saturn as material gets to dissolve back into ether. In my third house of community and connections, of course my mother was going to be challenged health-wise during that time, because my Gemini moon is conjunct my Saturn natally in the sixth house as well. And the moon is the relationship to the mother, and Saturn, again, physical, harsh reality. So, of course, she was going to experience something like that. But nobody in this quote-unquote spiritual space that I was in wanted to give the compassionate room for me to experience that to the fullest extent, other than the owner. Everybody else held it against me because I was just quote-unquote young, stupid, and immature, when I was really going through one of the hardest transits and hardest experiences in my life. So that's not me saying that to get sympathy points or to talk shit about people. What it is to say is that I went through the hardest experience of my life up until this point, from a Saturnian cycle standpoint, in my second Saturn square. My first Saturn square was pretty challenging with my parents splitting up. That was pretty intense because, Saturn can be the father figure and the moon is the mother, and I have those conjunct natally in my sixth house, and so Virgo being in my ninth house, spiritually, philosophy, kind of experiences and beliefs versus facts and logic, of course, that, separated my parents from each other. So Saturn and moon got challenged by Saturn itself. So with that being said, to go through the opposite version of that, where Saturn, instead of in the first square was in Virgo, the second square was in the opposite sign Pisces. This then, instead of it being about the real world challenging my dynamic, it was about the people in the spiritual world challenging my dynamic. And that became a time where I had to crumble. I had to fall apart. I had to almost let go of all of my spiritual practices and identities and ways that I was showing up in the world in order to fully let go of the versions of those spiritual identities and practices that weren't actually serving me, or weren't serving the collective, or serving the earth in her ability to support us and nourish us back. And luckily, I had a friend that I got to live with during that time who held the space for me, because she was starting to go through her Saturn return at the same time that I was beginning my Saturn square, and that was a whole other experience, a whole other conversation we can have for another day. But that was really kind of my saving grace during that time. But continuing on from that point, I also went through the first, most challenging, karmically dense, narcissistically abusive relationship that I had been through up until this point in my life. But with that being said, that relationship showed me all of the parts of myself that I had held on to from a wounding standpoint, and had let other people perpetuate in my narrative for me just because I wanted to outsource my emotional validity through love of any kind, whether that was familial, platonic, romantic, professional. I was outsourcing my ability to be loved or to feel connection to unconditional love, which is Pisces. Of course that was going to get challenged. And so it was also a time where making money for me was very challenging. Again, Saturn square. 6th house, all about daily money making. 3rd house, other people, community, spirituality. Saturn's there, squaring my natal Saturn in the other sign. So it's a really intricate, messy dynamic. And as we age, as we go through more of these Saturn cycles throughout our life, they will get more complicated. But don't let that fool you. Don't let that scare you. And don't let that intimidate you from stopping pursuing your ability to structuralize yourself through these transits. Because these cycles, every time that they happen, they give you more and more and more reward on the other side of doing the hard work that they are asking you to do. And once I embodied, full chills on my body right now as I'm saying this, so this is real goosey bumpy confirmation from spirit. When you complete these cycles and you understand and integrate the lessons from these cycles, you will reap the rewards of the wisdom of the hard-earned mileage and experience that they give you. So that way those boundaries become concrete. Those lessons become wisdom. They aren't just facts and experiences anymore. These things that challenge your soul to evolve become what make you stronger and strongest after having been through them. So chronologically, next then we would obviously move into the Saturn return, like we mentioned in the beginning. I mentioned a little bit more of Saturn conjunction just by natal position and in the first few years of your life. So let's briefly touch on the Saturn return again, because I've watched so many different people in my life go through a Saturn return, even within the last 10 years of my life, with different connections, professional relationships, even educational relationships, platonic relationships, anything, you name it, I've watched people do it. The most prominent example that I will amplify first here in the timeline for you to make sense of is when I was 18 years old. This was before my second Saturn square even had any influence on me or even begun to enter the sign where it would be my second Saturn square. This is when Saturn was still in Aquarius, and this was a very beautiful time for me. But with that being said, I was in a relationship with someone who was 10 years older than me. So I was 18 and I was in a relationship with somebody who was 27, about to turn 28. And they were going through the meat of their Saturn return, like the juicy, dense, like the protein of it all, like the thing that's really most impactful of the Saturn return. They were living back at home with their mother. They were sharing rent with her. They were trying to figure out what to do as a job. They had just gotten out of a really bad legal situation, but this person was a good person and was doing their best to stay a good person despite everything they had been through. And the grace that I watched this person have, even with me, through that time period, even after going through everything that they went through themselves, that was so profound and impactful. At the time, I didn't really know a whole lot about Saturn returns. I had only been studying astrology up until that point for about 3.5 years or so, give or take. But I watched and witnessed a Saturn return unfolding in front of me. And it was, as much as it was messy to be a part of secondhand and to watch happen to somebody, it was also very enlightening and very beautiful to experience as well, because then, later on, with other people who I watched have a Saturn return not be as graceful or not be as kind or not be as gentle, it gave me more perspective onto what is possible to happen during a Saturn return and what is possible for you to choose to respond to that Saturn return with. And this person, when I was 18 and dating them when they were 27, 28, that was the most beautiful Saturn return experience I think I've seen somebody have. From, at least, involved in my life standpoint as much as possible, because that relationship was quite short-lived. But the next prominent example is one of my friends who went through a Saturn return at the same time that I was going through a Saturn square. And that experience was a little more heartbreaking for me personally. That was a really challenging time already for me going through my own Saturn square, but then watching this person lose everything that they worked so hard for so long, and almost give in to quitting a promise that they made to themselves and almost giving up on a vision that they set for themselves for the future that, again, they had been working for so many years for, had dedicated almost 12 years of their life to at that point. And that was an example for me of, at the same time, like I mentioned, going through my second Saturn square and having to let go of my spiritual practices and the ways that I was making money because they weren't serving me or the collective in the best and highest way anymore. It was a beautiful example of watching somebody go through that on a higher, grander, and more impactfully Saturnian level. And also them having the ability to respond to me with grace, but maybe not to their own life experience with as much grace. They were falling. They were letting so much of their identity go, letting so many people in their life go, letting so much of their career go, letting so much of the vision they held for themselves in the future and what was possible for them go. Yet at the same time, the door was being closed there. The window was being opened on the other side of the room for them. And I watched them spiritually flourish because this was a place where Saturn, again, for this person, was natally, so this is a Saturn return. Saturn in Pisces is dissolving the structure to allow for the spirit to create the structure for you. And I watched this person's spirit create so much new magic for them in their life. They went from being somebody who outsourced a lot of emotional validity through work, career, and productivity to then insourcing their own validity through their creativity, through their spirituality, and through their own personal beliefs about what is possible for the future for them. And so, as much as it was heartbreaking to watch everything happen to this person that I love and care for so much, it was as equally beautiful to witness and hold space for the evolution of this person's soul. And it was like watching the goddess leave a cage that she had been put in by the patriarchy. And it was the most beautiful Saturn return experience I think I've watched somebody have from a personal standpoint secondhand. So, with that being said, we've covered the four most important Saturn cycles. These cycles will repeat again because a Saturn conjunction is the same as a Saturn return. And so what happens when it goes right back to where it came from? It goes in the cycle all over again. So you'll have a third Saturn square, a second Saturn opposition, a fourth Saturn square, and a second Saturn return. And it will just keep going and going and going until you're gone. And so with that being said, I invite you to look at all of the different times in your life that you've already experienced Saturn cycles, to give yourself leeway and grace and compassion for these different times of your life, so that way they can soften. The rigidity of Saturn's grip on your consciousness can be loosened and softened, so that way you can receive the medicine of those experiences from a more holistic and grounded place. And from that medicine that you receive, you get to then integrate every bit of juicy, delicious, insightful wisdom and experience from those times in your life, and they get to become your mastery. So I hope that this has been helpful for you to understand Saturnian cycles a little bit easier, and I hope that it resonated with you. Let me know down below in the comment section what Saturn cycle has been the most impactful for you in your life. Was it a Saturn return? Was it a conjunction that you just remember an early on memory from really early in this life? Or was it a Saturn square? Was it an opposition? Let me know. I'm curious. I want to hear from you down below in the comments, or in the comment section of a review if you're listening instead of watching. So with that being said, I will leave it here. I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to listen to this episode of Hummingbird Arcana. If you're watching on YouTube and you enjoyed, let me know by liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and turning on that post notification bell. It really helps me out pushing my free content out for you guys in the algorithm, and I really hope to get more of this out for you as well. And if you're listening instead of watching on a streaming platform, hi, hello. How are you? I humbly implore you to rate the podcast, leave a review, and in the comment section of that review, again, let me know which Saturnian cycle was the most impactful for you. If you're enjoying this podcast so far, what episode was your favorite, any ideas for guests or future topics you would like me to have on the show. And with that being said, I again appreciate you so much for taking the time out of your day to listen to this episode of Hummingbird Arcana. I am Jo Hummingbird. It is my greatest honor and pleasure to assist you in awakening you to your cosmic divinity. Many blessings and take great care, my friends.